Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and today I'm going to be talking about some classics. Now, I read a lot of classic literature, but I also read from a lot of different genres. And I think because of that, I often have people ask me, like, where should I start if I want to get into classic literature? And despite the common advice to start with something short or something that is easy to get into, I quite frequently suggest that people start with a genre they already enjoy. So today I'm going to do that popular booktube video, which is if you like this book, try that book. But in this case, I'm going to do if you like this trope, try this classic novel. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. I have a stack of books to recommend here. And for each one, I am going to talk about a contemporary trope and maybe even a book that may be an example of that. I'm going to talk about a book that I have read and hopefully one that I want to read. And it's gonna be a little bit loosey-goosey. There are a couple of tropes that I just don't tend to read, but I've done enough research that hopefully the book that I choose for that's contemporary is accurate. For the books that I haven't read that are on my TBR, I'm again also just going with the best information I have on them, but feel free to comment below with any corrections as well as any suggestions you may have for this. I'm going to start with the popular genre of romance, and I'm specifically going to talk about the trope of enemies to lovers. I feel like this is something that I see people talk about all the time, and I wasn't even sure if I would have a book that worked for this. I feel like one of the books that I see going around a lot that apparently has an enemies to lover is Beach Read by Emily Henry. So if you like that kind of trope in your romance novel or just in your books in general where people start out hating each other and end up falling in love, one book that I've read that is a classic novel that I would suggest trying is Pride and Prejudice. A lot of people really like Jane Austen. This is one of her more popular works, and honestly, I think because a lot of people like the enemies to lovers in there. Jane Austen in general was probably the person that I would say created a subgenre within romance literature at her time. Like she's the, in some ways, original Regency romance. So if that's something you also like, that's a great book for that. But if you're wanting to try something maybe more simple than Jane Austen, I would also recommend the classic by Ellen Montgomery, Anne of Green Gables, which in my opinion is actually a better enemies to lover. In fact, it's probably my favorite personal enemies to lover, even though Anne of Green Gables itself is not a romance novel. There's definitely a great romance in there, and it's definitely one of the best enemies to lovers I've read to date. Now, perhaps enemies to lovers is not your thing, but you like a good love triangle? Because who doesn't? And let's say you went with something like The Hunger Games, which again isn't like a romance novel, but guys, there's romance in a lot of books. But you may like the fact that there's a bit of love triangle action going on in the background. Well, if you're looking for a classic that has that going on, I would suggest really anything by Thomas Hardy. But my favorite that I'm going to recommend would be The Woodlanders. This is definitely a book that contains a romance. Most of Thomas Hardy's novels do, and a lot of them contain love triangles. In fact, quite frequently, they'll contain love pentagons or hexagons, and he does a lot of different shapes. It comes up in a lot of different ways. So if you like complicated romantic relationships where somebody else's are getting in the way, yeah, try Thomas Hardy, but my suggestion is The Woodlanders. And the next one that I want to read that apparently has a love triangle in it is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. I've heard really good things about this book. It does fit the idea of not that long of a classic, and there are a lot of people who this is their favorite work by Charles Dickens. And it just happens to have a love triangle in it, so that might work for you. Next up, if you are looking for a little bit of forbidden love in your romance novel, let's say that you like a good romance, but you like when, there's star-crossed lovers, that kind of thing. You could also go back to Thomas Hardy for that. It's really always a struggle for the people you want to come together to get together. But let's say you read something like The Night Circus, which I feel like definitely has a forbidden romance in there and things are not supposed to happen, and I feel like there's literally stars and crossed lovers. Another good classic that would be similar to that would be Anna Karenina. Definitely a forbidden love is happening in here, but you also have romance where you feel like two characters may never get together, no matter how much you may want them to. Another great forbidden romance, I think, would be found in Madame Bovary. This is the next book that I want to read that contains that trope. And yeah, this is definitely going to be on the darker, sadder side from what I understand. The next genre and tropes I'm going to look at fall under the category of mysteries. I don't read a lot of mysteries or books that have a lot of mystery tropes in them, but I do read quite a few books that have mysteries in them, if that makes sense. The one modern book that I can think of that I've read that contained an amateur sleuth, however, was The Maid. And this I actually read for my family book club, and it definitely has some crime in there. There is an amateur sleuth trying to, solve the case, that kind of thing. And there are some detectives involved. And if you wanted to read a classic novel that had some similar tropes, I would suggest The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. In fact, if you just like mysterious things happening in your books in general, Wilkie Collins has a whole bunch of novels that he has written that have that trope in there. But The Moonstone is the one where you're going to find somebody who's trying to solve a mystery. There's a detective. You will find yourself thinking and trying to figure out if you can solve the crime along with them. And it's told from multiple perspectives, which I always think is fun in a book. The other book that I want to read next would be The Name of the Rose, which, as I understand, is a monk or maybe multiple monks trying to figure out who's knocking off other monks. Sounds very strange to me. Takes place in I don't remember, 1300s at an abbey. And I have heard lots of things like this book is very difficult to read, which is a good challenge to me. But if you would like something that's lighter, another classic that you could read that I feel like is pretty well known is The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which is definitely that detective mystery thing. Though, if you didn't know, was inspired by the detective in The Moonstone. So you might want to start here. If the part of mystery and thrillers and that kind of thing that you like the most, however, is just the element of crime involved, well, then you might want to read something that is more on the side of crime or crime fiction, or is looking at the mind of a killer kind of in a similar way that true crime does. One crime novel that I read recently was The Trees, and this surprised me. I actually wasn't expecting it to fall within the crime genre, but that was my fault for not looking up more on the book. But you could also give The Mystery of Edwin Drood a try, again by Charles Dickens. This is an excellent book, in my opinion, if you want to try and be a amateur sleuth, because this book was not finished, though it does feel complete in its writing. And so you actually never have the mystery solved in the book. In fact, so many people have been like tempted to solve it that there have been actual like cases held by people in a mock court trying to solve the case of the mystery of Edwin Drood. There are still people today who try and solve this. So if Myrtle and mystery solving and unsolved mysteries is your thing, or you just like true crime, this is going to give you a very similar feel of you trying to figure it out yourself. On the other hand, if you just want to get into the mind and psychology of a criminal, you might want to go with Good Old Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. This is one of the next books that I would like to read. I'm very fascinated by like the way that psychology comes up in Russian literature, and I've heard really good things about this book. We're going to move on to the genre of fantasy, and sort of the first trope or subgenre that I'm going to talk about is fantasy that has animal companions. I know this is a very popular trend as seen in books like Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials series, which I have not read, but I like the idea that there's animal companions in there. One of my favorite books as a child that was a classic that I read is Dr. Dolittle, where you have the veterinarian who can speak to his animals. Like, who doesn't love that? And the next book that I want to read that is fantasy that has animals in it that talk or whatever would be The Last Unicorn. I saw this movie as a child over and over and over again and loved it, and it scared the crap out of me, and both the things all at the same time. And I would love to read the book. Now, perhaps for fantasy, you prefer more epic fantasy or quest fantasy where somebody's going on a bit of a journey or it's approaching closer to high fantasy and feel. or you like a good myth in your fantasy, like in, say, Circe, which I've read and really enjoyed, you might want to go back to the original story of the Odyssey. There are nowadays lots of different translations of the Odyssey, and I highly recommend shopping around until you find a translation that you really want to read. And there's no better way to do that than by just reading the same passage or the opening passage over and over again quite frequently. Because this is in the public domain, you can see the first couple of pages or chapters online at most booksellers. So this is one that I have read, but definitely want to reread sometime soon, as well as another epic adventure, The Epic of Gilgamesh, which actually has the word epic in the title. And The Epic of Gilgamesh also has that sense of you get a bit of feeling of mythology going on, combined with the idea of travel and adventure and all of those things wrapped up into one very ancient story. But going back to epic fantasy or high fantasy and quest stories, I feel like a more recent sort of classic that has been very popular, especially I would say in the 80s and 90s, is the Sword of Shannara, which wasn't actually one of my favorite reads, but I definitely saw how it was related to some of the more classic and older fantasies. I think another good recent one is Eye of the World, which I think is a bit more in depth and maybe a more satisfying read for people. But if you really want to go back to the original classic epic journey quest fantasy story, then you've definitely got to go with The Lord of the Rings. I have it in this massive volume that has pictures and all the things. There you go. And this is definitely like the end goal, I think, for high fantasy. At some point, you should probably read this book just so you know where a lot of it is coming from. I have read this whole volume in this volume, which was very heavy, just saying. And yeah, and you also get a lot of really good movies to watch with it. Another genre you could try that I swear I don't read a lot of until I actually go back and look at it, but that genre is horror. And there are a lot of sort of subgenres and tropes in this, but I'm kind of going with horror that includes a bit of body horror and like monsters in it. For example, the book Drood that I read last year. This is a really good book, especially to get you in the classics, because he talks about a lot of Victorian classics, specifically by Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens in this. And just reading this more contemporary book may get you interested in reading some of their other works, though it does contain a lot of spoilers on those books. But it also has this creepy character going on in the background. You definitely get those gothic vibes. They're going down into crypts and morgues and cemeteries and all of those things, and there's a lot of body horror in this. Along those same lines of monsters, of course, there's the original Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This is your, I feel like one of your original like monster body horror, science gone wrong type of horror books, and is definitely in that gothic horror genre. If you want to go more on the side of mad scientist, you might want to try Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is a shorter story, and this is a bind up of multiple stories by Robert Louis Stevenson. And it's probably the next book that is a classic that's in that sort of genre that goes along that same line. In fact, I feel like there's some similarities going on here. If, however, in your gothic spooky books you prefer a little bit of romance, or at least you like that creepy gothic romance vibe with very problematic characters, I can think of three books, all of which I have read, that are classics at various points on the that have been published and written at various time periods. One would be The Phantom Opera, which is the book that I probably want to reread soon. And trust me, it's worth reading. It is not the same as the musical you may have seen or heard of. There's also The Romance of the Forest by Anne Radcliffe, which is actually typically considered one of the first Gothic novels. It is high adventure. You have a female in peril being chased by evil people, and she gets locked up in all sorts of different places. There are skeletons, crypts, cemeteries, old castles, you name it, it's in there. And the other book that is very similar that will start pushing you into that thriller suspense genre is actually written by Louisa May Alcott of Little Women, and that would be The Long Fatal Love Chase. So you get romance in there, you definitely get a long chase, high suspense. very like heart pounding what's going to happen next. And it's a super exciting read that feels very contemporary in nature, but was actually written in the early 1900s. Next up, I want to give some examples of sci-fi that you could try out. So let's say your science fiction thrill has to do with aliens or the possibility of aliens or other life forms. Like I recently read XX by Ryan Hughes, and there was always this mysterious element of something that may or may not be aliens in there. And I really enjoyed this long, chunky book. And it also falls into that trope of being mixed media or ergopic fiction. So this is one that is contemporary that I would recommend if you haven't read, but if you have read it and you enjoyed it, another book that you might want to try getting you into the classics is War of the Worlds, which I feel like is one of those like very typical alien invasion type of novels. In fact, a lot of people know the story of how it was being read on the radio at one point and was being performed so well that people actually thought it wasn't a radio show, but a radio broadcast, and that there was actually an alien invasion. So, talk about being well written and creeping you out. A slightly more contemporary sci fi classic would be Stranger in a Strange Land. I would like to read this soon, and yeah, let's just say it's a twist on the idea of an alien invasion. And then who would I be if I didn't talk about some sort of apocalyptic dystopian science fiction? I personally really enjoy The Parable of the Sower and the Whole Earth Seed books. I read both book one and two, and they were really good just in terms of getting you into that mindset of things in the world have gone really wrong and government systems have fallen apart and it's just a complete disaster. I mean, it's also kind of sad and scary in that sense, as is 1984, which is a book that I've also read and is a classic work of literature that I think also follows very similar dystopic themes. A book that I want to read would be The Last Man by Mary Shelley. And this has some sort of unknown to me as of yet dystopian vibes slash end of time vibes. I think there's a pandemic involved. Sometimes these books get a little too close to home, but I think I'm ready for it. If in sci fi, however, the thing that you enjoy or prefer is space or time travel, then I would recommend The Martian as a recent read. Or if you've read The Martian and again you're trying to get more into classics, you might want to try Slaughterhouse Five, which, is going to seem like an odd choice, but I feel like is a really good book in terms of getting you at least into a modern classic. And within that, you have a lot of things. You have potentially aliens, you have what's going on at the current time period that it's written. You also have space and or maybe time travel. It's a strange book, but it's definitely worth the read. A book that I would want to read that seems to fall into the same category would be The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. I've heard very good things about this book. I have read Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, and I think this is where I would want to go with him next. That's it. I now have a complete mess next to me. But hopefully that gives you some ideas of books to look more into, find out more what they're about, and to help you realize that classics don't need to seem as far from your normal reading taste as they are made out to be at times. Because the truth is, classic literature is not a genre. It's actually a literary time period, and there are genres within that genre that you yourself may enjoy. But in some ways, that's a whole nother topic that I'll probably talk about sometime soon. Anyway, let me know if there are some subgenres or genres or tropes that I didn't mention that you would like some recommendations for. Leave those in the comments below, and maybe I'll do another video like this. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this or want to see me read some of the books that I mentioned, and I will talk to you next time.